Hey there, social students. So, as promised, we have a second installment in our culture and society piece, and we're going to be taking a look at the idea of subculture and countercultures first, okay? So a subculture is the values and related behaviors of a group that distinguish its members from a larger culture, kind of like a world within a world. So they have their own type of language, right? Let's say if we were looking at maybe like an example of a motorcycle enthusiast, they definitely have their own type of language with that. They have mechanical knowledge. They know different types of motorcycles. And if you were to come up to a motorcycle enthusiast and you didn't know anything about motorcycles, you would probably be a little lost in that conversation. There are plenty of others who have other groups that we could talk about, like cowboys or surfers or even teachers. One of the funniest things I always do when I go home is if my husband asks me what kind of day I had, and I kind of sit there and I think, and I'm like, well, what can I actually tell him that he's going to understand? Because unless you're another teacher, sometimes you just don't understand some of those things, and vice versa. He works in the business world and he tries to tell me about the things that are happening in different markets, and I have no inclination or clue even to know what he's talking about. That's just an example of a subculture. Now, counterculture is a little bit different. It's a group whose values, beliefs, norms, and related behaviors place its members in opposition to the broader culture. So oftentimes this is in direct opposition and it has negative effects. So an example is like Hell's Angels motorcycle gang. Sorry, I know I've got motorcycles on there and I don't know why, but apparently motorcycles are the deal. Anyways, they go against our societal norms, and that's what a counterculture does. It goes directly against, direct opposition against what is believed and perceived to be culturally correct and normal. So, oftentimes I like to kind of sit here and think, what do we value, right? So if I were to ask you, what are some of your values? I could practically guarantee at least one of these would pop up on your particular radar. When I sit down and think, I value things like integrity, education, hard work, and freedom. And when I look, almost all of those are up here for the United States values. So it has been compiled by sociologists what the United States, what we as Americans actually value. And they include things like achievement and success, individualism, hard work, things like material comfort and freedom and democracy, education, leisure. Well, who doesn't love leisure, right? Physical fitness, concerns for the environment. These things are either culturally acceptable now with our values or are starting to be kind of up and coming in our cultural values, which we'll talk about in a little bit, okay? So, although the United States is a pluralistic society, which means that we're made up of many groups, each has its own set of values, and certain values, however, will dominate. And these are called our core values, okay? So, core values do not change without opposition. Some values cluster together to form a larger whole called value clusters, okay? Those would be like the types of things that go together, which we'll talk about here in just a second, so I'll tell you all about it. Value contradictions, such as equality versus sexism and racism, that indicates areas of tension, which are likely to points of social change. And so anytime we have that tension within our nation, as you can probably see if you pay attention to the news at all, that anytime we have something like this happen, we start to see change. I'm watching currently right now a show called The West Wing. I know it's old and whatever, but I like political dramas. I know, so sue me. I'm a social studies teacher. So anyways, in this show, it's so interesting. It aired back in, I believe it was 1998. And one of the main issues that they start tackling in the first couple seasons is gays in the military, right? And it was at the time, a time when we had the don't ask, don't tell policy. And I found it so interesting that something that's now, over 20 years later, we're looking at, and it doesn't really seem to be that much of an issue because it's something that we are, accepting of now in this nation. So our values do change, but usually it's with those contradictions that we start to see that social change happen. So you really have to be aware of things that are happening around you. And then of course, now one of the big things is, so now that we have gays in the military and it's not as big of a deal and we don't have that don't ask, don't tell policy or whatever, now it's transsexuals. What are we supposed to do with people like that? Are they allowed in the military? And again, that's that value contradictions piece. So we have to be looking constantly to see what is going to change in our society, in our culture. Okay. So things like leisure, so I told you we'd get to that like kind of emerging value cluster, right? Leisure and self-fulfillment and physical fitness and youthfulness and the concerns for the environment, these are kind of what younger people are trending towards now in terms of their own values. And so this is what we would call an emerging value cluster, because these things are not fully embraced by all of our what do you call it, our demographics, with our ages and everything. But it is something that is emerging. Okay. And finally, we're going to talk about technology in the global village. So we're going to talk about cultural lag. So what is cultural lag? It really describes how a group's non-material culture lags behind its changing technology. So like, for example, snail mail, right? Old-fashioned snail mail. Not every culture in the world has access right at their fingertips to email, and so they do have to engage in regular old mail, through our mail systems. Okay, but with today's technological advances in trade, travel, communication, cultural diffusion is occurring rapidly, which means that cultures are starting to come together, right? So for example, like if you have fashions in Europe and there's a fashion show going on, it's being live streamed, right? For a fashion week, whatever, it's being live streamed to the United States, it's being live streamed over in Japan, Singapore. Everyone can see these fashions coming out for the next season, which is really starting to lead to what we call cultural leveling, right? Groups become very similar and they start to adopt items from other cultures. The problem is, or at least a lot of people are starting to see that the problem is there's a lot less diversity within the world because some of our rich cultures are being lost in this process of cultural diffusion. So it's just something to consider as we look at this from a sociological perspective. I hope that this was short, sweet, and to the point, and please let me know if you have any questions regarding the content. Thank you so much, Soc students. You're the best.